October 14th, 1943. Paris, France. The city was thick with tension, the air heavy with the dread of being caught. The streets hummed with the oppressive sounds of occupation. The clang of German boots on cobblestones, the distant rumble of military trucks, the low murmur of whispered conversations behind closed doors. In the heart of Paris, a resistance was brewing. Not in the grand halls of political figures or through the pages of underground newspapers, but in the shadows of ordinary people living out extraordinary lives. Among these quiet rebels was Lucienne. At 22, she was small in stature, her dark eyes often hidden behind a veil of auburn hair. But there was an intensity about her, something sharp and unyielding. She had grown up in the quieter corners of Paris, a city she had always known as a place of both grandeur and struggle. The occupation, however, had left it unrecognizable. The glamour of the boulevards was now a ghost. The cafes, once filled with laughter, now emptied of joy, replaced by fear. But Lucienne had learned early that survival was about more than just staying hidden. It was about fighting back in ways that the enemy would never expect. It began with small acts of defiance, stolen glances at the German soldiers who walked by, whispered insults in her mother tongue when no one was looking. But small acts had no power. They were only a release for frustration, not a strike against the oppressors. Lucienne knew that to truly make a difference, she would have to do something grander, something bolder, and above all, something unseen. It was during one of these early, clandestine moments that she had witnessed a simple scene that would change her life forever. A German officer, drunk and laughing, wandered out of a local bar with a woman on his arm, leaving his jacket carelessly slung over a chair. Lucienne had no idea who the officer was, nor did she care. What she noticed, with startling clarity, was the jacket, its insignia, its fabric, its smell of sweat and cigarettes. It was not just a piece of clothing. It was a key, an entry point into a world she had been watching from the shadows for too long. The idea bloomed in her mind slowly, like the seeds of a deadly flower. She didn't need to storm an armory or sneak into a military base. She just needed to take what was already there, right under their noses. The stolen uniform was not an end, but the means to an end. It could grant her access to places no one would suspect her of entering. It would cloak her in the very authority that crushed so many others, and she could use it to slip through enemy lines unnoticed. But stealing a uniform from an officer was not simple. She would need to blend into the world of the German military, to learn their habits, their movements, their secrets. She needed to become one of them, in every sense of the word. This was no small risk. If she were caught, if they discovered what she was doing, it would mean not only her death, but the end of everything she had worked for. There was no room for error, no second chance. But the stakes, in her eyes, were higher than her own survival. Every inch of Paris that was suffocated under Nazi control was a betrayal of its soul. She could not just hide in a corner. She had to strike back, quietly, cleverly, in a way that no one would ever suspect. The uniform became the symbol of her rebellion, a perfect disguise. She began to study the German officers, mimicking their mannerisms and accents, listening for their weaknesses. She observed how they interacted with one another, the routines they followed. She took notes, internalized their rhythms, and began to take smaller risks. First, it was just watching from afar, waiting for the right opportunity. Then, it was gathering the right equipment, an officer's cap here, a belt there, each piece of the puzzle falling into place. The first theft came late at night, when the streets of Paris were quieter and the Germans less vigilant. Lucienne had managed to slip into the barracks of an officer she had been following for weeks. She took what she needed with the precision of a surgeon: the jacket, the boots, the gloves. She even managed to get a handful of paperwork, which she could use to gain access to classified information. Every action was done with care, every movement measured. But there was no time for hesitation. She had learned quickly that the enemy was efficient, and she would need to outpace them in every way. With the uniform now in her possession, Lucienne began her mission in earnest. She started with the smaller operations, picking up bits of intelligence that could be used to disrupt the German military's logistics. Maps, orders, anything that would give the resistance an advantage. Her role was simple but crucial: feed the resistance the information they needed to undermine the occupation. But there was no glory in it for her. No one would know her name. No one would praise her efforts. She was, for all intents and purposes, a shadow. At times, the risk weighed heavily on her. There were nights when she couldn't sleep, moments when the walls seemed to close in, when the fear of being caught, of being betrayed, felt like a physical weight on her chest. The thought of losing everything, her family, her friends, her life, was always there, lurking in the back of her mind. But there was something else too. The sense that she was doing something greater, something that might change the course of the war, that kept her moving forward. For Lucienne, the stakes were clear. If she could continue her work, even in the smallest way, it might be enough to spark the resistance and bring the Nazis down from within. But the more she slipped into the skin of a German officer, the more complicated the task became. She had to avoid suspicion from both the occupying forces and her own people. She had to be careful not to cross any lines that might reveal her true intentions. In the quiet spaces between her acts of sabotage, Lucienne began to feel the weight of what she was doing. The uniform, once just a tool of subversion, now became a symbol of her dual identity. She was no longer entirely herself. She was becoming something else, something that existed only in the spaces between truth and deception. As Lucienne continued her work, the resistance began to gain ground, but the Gestapo was catching on. The cracks in their operations were starting to show. Unbeknownst to Lucienne, someone had begun to notice the pattern, the unusual movement of German officers, the sudden influx of information that seemed too good to be true. A suspicion was beginning to grow, not just about the resistance, but about the thief who had stolen far more than just a uniform. And that suspicion would soon bring her to the brink of discovery. January 19th, 1944. Occupied Paris. The city was no longer a place of simple occupation. It had become a sprawling chessboard, with each move and counter-move creating ripples in the lives of those caught between the lines. Lucienne knew the stakes now. The stolen uniforms had given her an entry into a world of secrets. But with each passing day, the lines between the German officer she mimicked and the person she had once been began to blur. It was no longer just about stealing information. It was about survival, deception, and above all, the terrifying responsibility of being inside the enemy's heart. She had learned how to walk with the swagger of a German officer, how to speak with an authority that didn't belong to her. She wore the uniform with the precision of someone who knew it was her only shield, the thin line that separated her from death. Every gesture was rehearsed. Every word was carefully chosen. The Nazis weren't dumb. They could spot a fake in a heartbeat. But Lucienne had an instinct for this, an almost unnatural ability to mimic their behavior, to slip into their world unnoticed. Her first real test came when she was sent to an SS headquarters to retrieve documents, classified intelligence that could provide invaluable insight into the movement of German troops. The SS was one of the most feared branches of the Nazi machine, and Lucienne knew she would have to be careful. She had spent weeks studying the officers who worked there, observing their habits, memorizing the faces and learning their names. But this time, it wasn't enough to simply blend in. She would need to act with precision, to do the unthinkable, to convince the Gestapo that she was one of them. The tension that ran through her veins as she walked through the doors of the headquarters was suffocating. She could feel the weight of every eye on her, the scrutiny of men who would kill without hesitation, who would burn cities to the ground without a second thought. But they saw nothing in her, just another officer, another cog in the machine. They didn't notice the slight nervousness in her movements, the brief hesitation when she was asked a question she hadn't anticipated. She was a perfect mirror of the men around her, mirroring their arrogance, their self-assuredness, even as her heart raced with the knowledge of what was at stake. Inside, the building was a labyrinth of cold marble floors and steel desks, filled with the hum of radios and the constant shuffle of papers. Lucienne had prepared herself for the sterile, mechanical nature of their operations, but she hadn't prepared herself for how alive it felt. The buzzing energy of men consumed by their power, the frantic, clinical rhythm of war. The SS officers moved like clockwork, each task an extension of the last, as if the machinery of Nazi power had oiled itself into an unthinking, unstoppable force. But Lucienne wasn't afraid. She had seen their kind before, men who wore their authority like armor, but whose eyes betrayed the cracks in the facade. She was led through the building to an office where the documents were kept. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she kept her face impassive, like the officers she had studied. She had memorized their cold gaze, the way they never looked away, never showed weakness. As she stood in front of the desk, her mind worked quickly, scanning the room for potential threats. She knew the layout of the office, knew where the guards were positioned, and knew the exact distance between her and the exit. Every movement had been calculated in advance. She was a ghost, unseen, untouchable. The officer at the desk glanced up at her, his steely blue eyes betraying no emotion. "You're late," he said in a clipped voice. Lucienne didn't falter. She met his gaze with the same coldness he showed her, pushing the slightest hint of annoyance into her voice. "There was an issue with the documents," she replied smoothly, her accent perfect, her words clipped and authoritative. He didn't question her further. Instead, he reached for the folder on his desk, sliding across to her. For a moment, she felt her pulse quicken. This was it. She took the documents without hesitation, slipping them into the inner pocket of her uniform, her fingers brushing against the paper with a cool, practiced motion. The exchange was seamless, unnoticed. In and out. It was all coming together, the puzzle pieces of her audacious plan fitting perfectly into place. But as she turned to leave, something shifted in the air. A shift too subtle for most to notice, but Lucienne's instinct screamed at her. A sharp sound behind her, the scrape of a chair against the floor, followed by a voice. "Wait!" It was the officer who had been sitting at the desk, his eyes narrowing as he stood up from his chair. Lucienne's heart skipped a beat. She could feel the weight of the moment pressed down on her like a vice. He was staring at her too intently now, as if something about her wasn't right. He took a step forward, his boots echoing ominously in the silence of the room. "Something about you seems off," he said, his voice low, almost conversational. Lucienne froze. Her mind raced, her every thought focused on finding an escape, on finding the lie that would save her. She could feel the tension crackling between them, thick enough to suffocate. Her fingers twitched by her side, aching to pull the pistol hidden in her belt, but she didn't move. Not yet. Her best weapon, she knew, was her mind, and her mind told her to keep calm, to stay in control. She didn't blink. "I've been told I have that effect on people," she replied, her voice steady despite the storm of adrenaline rushing through her. "Perhaps you should get some rest, officer. You look tired." For a long moment, he said nothing. He simply studied her with those cold, piercing eyes, as if weighing every word, every gesture. Then, with an abrupt nod, he turned away and returned to his desk, the suspicion in his eyes fading as quickly as it had come. Lucienne exhaled slowly, allowing herself a fraction of a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. It was too close. Far too close. She couldn't afford to let her guard down again. She left the office without another word, her footsteps echoing softly in the empty hallway. Each step brought her closer to the exit, closer to safety. But she knew it wouldn't last. The more she played this game, the closer she came to being caught. The line between the woman she was and the officer she pretended to be was becoming impossibly thin. The stolen uniform had become more than just a tool. It had become a mask, one she couldn't take off, not without exposing herself for who she really was. As she slipped into the night, blending with the shadows like a ghost, Lucienne's mind raced. She had survived the encounter, but she knew the price of her survival was far greater than she could have ever imagined. The Nazis were not fools. They would start watching her more closely. They would start noticing the cracks. And soon, her only option would be to slip even deeper into the role of the monster she had been pretending to be, or risk being consumed by it altogether. July 23rd, 1945. Paris, France. The war was over, but the streets of Paris had yet to exhale. The German occupation had fallen, leaving behind a city torn between victory and silence. The flags that once draped the city in symbols of terror were now gone, replaced by the banners of liberation. Yet in the wake of triumph, the ghosts of those who had fought to tear down the regime were left unseen, their contributions erased by the very people they had sought to save. Lucienne, once a woman of quiet defiance, had become a ghost herself, a shadow slipping through the cracks of history. She stood at the window of a small apartment overlooking the Seine, watching as the world changed before her eyes. The streets were filled with jubilant crowds, the air electric with celebration. The liberation of Paris was being written in every cheer, in every kiss exchanged under the euphoria of freedom. But Lucienne felt nothing. The city she had fought for, the city she had bled for, was now a stranger to her. The faces on the streets were different. The world she had fought for was nothing more than a memory, and she was no longer a part of it. Lucienne had survived the war, but she had paid a price. The uniform she had stolen so long ago had been both her weapon and her curse. It had given her the chance to infiltrate the heart of the enemy, to gather intelligence that had helped to bring down the occupation. She had stood on the front lines of a battle that few had even seen, her actions unnoticed by most, her name unknown to the public. She had been nothing more than a shadow, a person hidden behind a mask of stolen authority, a mere cog in the vast, faceless machine of resistance. But now, as the world celebrated its victory, Lucienne was left with nothing. No recognition, no reward, no acknowledgement of her sacrifice. Her deeds, so crucial to the resistance's success, had been swept under the rug, forgotten in the chaos of post-war reconstruction. In the eyes of the world, she was no more than a footnote, if she was even that. She had risked everything, and for what? The men she had worked beside, the leaders she had trusted, had moved on. They had their victories, their accolades, their names etched into the history books. But Lucienne remained invisible, her contribution a mere whisper in the pages of time. She had come to realize, over the long months of liberation, that this was the fate of many like her. The women of the resistance, those who had fought behind enemy lines, had been forgotten, overshadowed by the more prominent figures of the war. Their roles had been minimized, their sacrifices ignored. Lucienne wasn't the only one whose story had been erased. Across France, there were countless others like her, women who had risked everything and asked for nothing, their bravery relegated to the shadows, their names lost in the fog of history. She had tried, once, to tell her story, to claim the recognition she so rightfully deserved. But the doors had been closed to her. The men who held the power to grant her the honor of recognition turned their backs, unwilling to acknowledge the contribution of a woman who had dared to fight. She had been told that her role was not important enough to be remembered, that her efforts, while valuable, were secondary to the work of the men who had led the charge. The resistance had been a man's world, and Lucienne's contribution, however critical, was relegated to the margins. So, she had faded into the background, content to disappear into the shadows, where she had always lived. She had no family left. Most had perished during the occupation, victims of both the war and the indifference that followed. She had no friends who understood what she had gone through, no one who could share the weight of her memories. She was alone, isolated in a world that had no place for her. The victories she had fought for had been claimed by others, and she had been left to pick up the pieces of a life that had never truly been hers to begin with.